Alrighty, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of History 119, and welcome to the second part of this two-part look at the critiques of consumerism alive in the 50s and 1960s and how they reflect countercultural sensibilities. In our first lecture, we talked about a number of intellectuals who were in various ways critiquing the post-war ideal so defined by consumerism. And then we saw how those critical sensibilities influenced the counterculture, its rejection of the world their parents made, and how that influenced elements of the consumer culture, including film and music. Let's conclude our look at critiques and countercultures here by examining more elements of this rejection of consumerism in various ways, or critique of consumerism. And in particular, we'll talk here in the second lecture about how that leads to a spate of laws, a spasm of reforms that are designed to regulate what is seen as the extreme power of corporations and manufacturers and marketers. One further element of the anti-consumerist sensibilities that are now manifesting in the early 60s is the emergence of consumer advocates, professional figures who are working to raise awareness about some of the more pernicious aspects of the consumer culture. One such consumer advocate was Sidney Margolis, who wrote a series of best-selling books in the early 60s that exposed the way in which American consumers were being ripped off, manipulated by a number of different industries. He talked about how auto repair scams prevailed and convinced Americans to do repairs on their cars that they did not need. He talked about how so many Americans were captive to onerous, burdensome interest rates from manipulative loans that they were duped into taking out. So Margolis looked at a number of different industries, and he revealed how manipulative they were. This is, again, on top of some of the similar insights we've seen developing in this period from Vance Packard and the quiz show scandals. There was this growing sensibility in America in the early 60s, thanks to the role of consumer advocates like Margolis, that you, the American consumer, are being lied to and ripped off. One of the books that Margolis wrote was titled The Great American Food Hoax. And he talked about how in this period with little regulation, food manufacturers could fill their products with all kinds of ingredients that were lacking in nutritional value. He talked about how there was no regulation of labeling, which would require the producers of breakfast cereals and other foodstuffs to tell you how much their product contained, the volume, the weight, which would allow consumers to do things like comparison shop and see whether or not they were getting a good deal. He talked about how many ads in this period were geared towards children and often urged them to pursue food that was unhealthy and deleterious to their growth. So he argued that one of those elements of American abundance, food, was again a hoax, a manipulation. Remember that photograph we saw in our lecture on the Cold War of a typical American family and all the food that they would consume in a year, that icon in many ways of abundance that was key to celebrating consumer capitalism. Well, Margolis in this book, The Great American Food Hoax, is saying that seeming abundance is really predicated on lies, manipulation, and deception. He also, in his books, critiqued the era of affluence by, like Packard in The Wastemakers, piercing the facade of this affluence and exposing what was often unseen, the way in which a lot of people, in order to maintain this lifestyle of a house in the suburbs, a new car, an annual vacation to Disneyland, had to go into debt, relied on second jobs, what was sometimes called moonlighting, which was often seen as shameful, that you were working a second job at night because you couldn't afford to pay your bills, And also, despite the way in which the gender ideologies of this period prize this idea of men going to work as breadwinners and women staying home, that really wasn't the case, particularly for working class families that needed two incomes in order to sustain their claims to the post-war ideal. So not only did Margolis demonstrate how the manufacturers of products were manipulative, deceptive, ripping American consumers off, but he also really went after the whole notion of an era of affluence and prosperity celebrated in America by demonstrating that so many Americans are cut off from that affluence, still living impoverished lives, or those who do really do it through this process of debt, through an effort to hide their poor incomes by moonlighting and working second jobs and relying on two incomes. And because of the shame often associated with that, that you had to have two jobs to sustain that lifestyle, that your wife worked outside the home, a lot of the people that Margolis profiled internalized a shame, and that insulated the broader economy and institutions of power from being targeted for, again, policies that seem to make it harder and harder for Americans in this period to live the good life. So one key consumer advocate, a brand new social role. This really did not exist prior to the 1960s. This public figure whose role is to expose, in a muckraker-like sensibility. We talked about muckrakers in our very first lecture, exposing what was hidden. Here are the muckrakers of the 1960s, these consumer advocates who emerge with a very pointed and focused critique at some of the failings of the consumer economy and society in the post-war period. The most famous and consequential of these consumer advocates, Ralph Nader, who made a huge splash in 1965 with the publication of his book, Unsafe at Any Speed, which was a scathing critique of General Motors and the cars that they produced, that Nader argues were deliberately produced by GM as unsafe vehicles. The focus of this book was the Chevy Corvair, which was a rear-engine car produced by Chevy in the early 60s that was found to be extremely dangerous, particularly because if it was hit from behind, a rear-engine car, Corvair was a rear-engine car. The idea was by putting the engine in the back, it would better balance the car. But actually, this rear-engine car was susceptible to exploding if it was hit from the back. And so Nader, in this book, reveals a lot of the fruits of his research that documented that GM knew this. They knew that they were producing a car that was dangerous and deadly. He also argues that this is a period where many American cars are deliberately produced to be dangerous in order to maintain corporate profits, that the rising tide of car injuries is not just a product of more cars and more driving, but the cars that are being produced that could include basic features of safety like seat belts and shatterproof glass, but the manufacturers of these cars refuse to include that in these cars because it would lower their profits. And so in order to maximize their profits, they were making cars that were indeed unsafe at any speed. The idea here was they could make cars that are safer. They could include safety belts. They could include shatterproof glass. They could include a number of safety features that would prevent the loss of life or injury, but they don't, because it might mean a little bit less money coming in as profits. Here, Ralph Nader was targeting an icon of 1950s consumerism, the automobile. We have talked in previous lectures about how the 1950s was an era of autotopia, good life, associated with cars, freeways, suburbanization. Nader here was going after that image, that icon of the good life, and arguing that that car in the driveway that you might imagine is a marker of success, the good life, freedom, opportunity, was instead a threat to your very life. And the reason for that is that the corporations producing these automobiles are deliberately making automobiles that are unsafe at any speed. Nader also argued that you have few choices when you go to purchase a car. You want a car, you need a car as part of this new suburban lifestyle, but your choices are limited because there's only a few manufacturers. And that's because rather than capitalism as a system of competition, free enterprise, consumer choice, as celebrated in the Cold War era and the post-war ideal, Nader argues that the American economic system is one of little competition, where power is aggrandized in the hands of just a few corporations that limit your choices, and they work diligently to prevent competition and free choice among consumers. One interesting element of Nader's critique was a direct assault on the celebration of capitalism that was so ubiquitous in the Cold War era, where Americans and people around the world were told capitalism creates opportunity choices, right? The good life, freedom. Look at our kitchens, the kitchen debate. You are free because you are free to choose from a variety of mixers, blenders, and deep freezes. Nader said that's not the case. Capitalism doesn't create more choices and more opportunity. It consolidates power and wealth in the hands of a few who wield that power to foreclose and prevent competition. He also argues that these corporations pay off politicians. They use their influence in lobbying efforts so that institutions that could be regulatory, like the federal government, refuse to establish those regulations as they are in league with these corporations. So it's a really interesting critique. And from this, Nader would become a very prominent figure. He was riding unsafe at any speed at a key moment where there was a growing embrace of a more critical sensibility. You know, think back on what we've learned now through the course of these two lectures. It's Vance Packard, it's Cindy Margolis, it is Ralph Nader. It is overall an age where so many Americans are becoming aware of manipulation, deceit, lies, the airy foundations upon which the relative affluence is constructed. And so Nader would build on the sensation and influence of unsafe at any speed to really build a career for himself that continued into the early 21st century as a strong advocate for consumers, a strong critic of corporations and their influence in our politics. Ralph Nader is a rather fascinating figure. He's a millionaire, but he lives a very simple life, very austere life. He never married, he never had children. He dedicated his entire life to his advocacy and career. He's a millionaire because GM went after him. They spied on him. They tried to dig up dirt on him to discredit him. And he later sued them for some of the things they did, which were illegal. And he won a huge judgment from GM. And then he kept every penny, or he used it as part of his advocacy efforts. So Ralph Nader is an interesting figure because he lived the life he preached. He was a man who really dedicated all of his ambitions and energies to his role as an advocate for what he saw as a little guy. And to that end, he argued for something that might change the balance between consumers and corporations. He wanted to support legal aid, legal assistance that would allow ordinary consumers to have their day in court. He argued that the little guy can't really stand up to GM, GE, Ford, the big corporations. What they need to do is band together and launch lawsuits that could force these corporations to make safer products, to be more transparent, to put pressure on politicians, to side not with the corporations, but with consumers. The mantra of the counterculture was power to the people, the idea of a bottom-up revolution, to wrest power away from corrupt institutions in our economy, in our politics, in the military, and return it to the many. That was at the heart of so many of the student protests, civil rights efforts, anti-Vietnam efforts of this period. And here we see it in the anti-consumerist advocacy and efforts of consumer advocates like Ralph Nader, who in a very similar way was arguing for a bottom-up revolution, power to the people. He argued power's in the hands of corporations, power's in the hands of big business. And we need to right that balance by empowering people through legal aid, legal assistance, information, and the role that he played. So of all the consumer advocates, the most prominent and influential, Ralph Nader. The net result of all of this, these critiques from intellectuals, the consumer advocacy, the greater awareness that Packard and others sought to engender, was a series of laws passed in the 1960s that responded to this much more assertive stance among consumers in opposition to manipulation. In 1960, Congress passes the Hazardous Substance Labeling Act, which required that certain substances known to be deleterious, dangerous to one's health appear on packaging so you knew what was in the item before you purchased it, informing consumers in this fashion. Child Protection Act, passed in 1966, banned certain toys that contain hazardous substances like lead paint. Not only were automobiles produced as death traps, as unsafe at any speed, but toys produced for children were laden with all kinds of hazardous materials. The Child Protection Act was designed to combat that. There was an effort to regulate advertising, to prevent the manipulation that again had been exposed by the hidden persuaders. Federal Trade Commission, the arm of the federal government that has command over certain products, required warnings on cigarettes that these are indeed cancer sticks deleterious to one's health. Eventually, that industry, the cigarette industry, was subject to regulation in terms of its access to public airways, where TV and radio ads were banned. Print ads could continue, posters and billboards, but no longer could you carry ads on television and radio, things that beam across the public airways, here promoting and advertising this product that was clearly demonstrated to be carcinogenic. Cigarettes. For a long time, that was also true for hard liquor, for spirits. It was also true that you could not advertise whiskey or other spirits. That, of course, is ended, and there's a great deal of advertising of spirits on television today. But it, too, is demonstrative of this moment where there was an effort to say some things cannot be marketed across, again, the public airways. In this case, cigarettes. If you are fans of that show Mad Men, which is this interesting look at the advertising industry in the mid-century period, there's a moment where the ad agency that is the focus of that particular show has to deal with this form of regulation, where now cigarettes bear this label that informs consumers of their hazards. And how do we get around this? How do we convince people to still puff up Lucky Strikes? So that TV show Mad Men, again, is a window into this moment where now this consumer good was subject to such regulation. Prior to that effort in the 60s to label cigarettes and ban forms of advertising associated with cigarettes, there were cartoon characters who were used in ads for cigarettes. There's an infamous, you could probably find it on YouTube, cigarette ad featuring the Flintstones, Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble puffing away, right? So they're using cartoon characters. They're using a program that's geared towards kids to sell cigarettes. That was possible before this regulation. It was also very common in print ads for Lucky Strike and other cigarette companies to feature doctors saying, this is the brand I smoke, it's good for you, right? So you'd have doctors who are ostensibly in charge of one's health and offering advice, now featured in cigarette ads. Well, that sort of manipulation using cartoon characters and figures of authority to market cigarettes now under regulation here in a very different context of the 1960s. Unsafe at Any Speed, published in 1965, led to direct action by the federal government. That's how impactful Nader's book was, that would require seatbelts and other safety devices like shatterproof glass, and in doing so, save lives. So here is a good example of how advocacy in the public realm led to changes in terms of law. Now, this was phased in This only applied to new cars manufactured after 66. These were lap belts, not the shoulder belts and other more sophisticated forms of restraint that we see in cars today. There's a great deal of resistance to this, people refusing to wear them even if they came in the car. It's not until really the late 20th century, the 1990s and early 21st century, that mandatory seatbelt laws would be in place where you had to use these. But an incremental step towards here, more choices for consumers as to whether or not to use these belts in a way that might save them from those death traps exposed in Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed. There was the Truth in Packaging Act. That was in many ways a response to Margoliss's The Great American Food Hoax that required that producers of food products include the weight, volume of their products so that you could comparison shop and you could see whether or not you're getting a good deal. There was an effort to include that material that empowered consumers in this way. And that's another way of thinking about this legislative reform in a way that also connects us to previous such periods like the Progressive Era and the New Deal. I stressed in the lectures we had earlier in the class that these regulations don't hurt corporations, though they're often represented in this way, onerous burdens, meddlesome government. They often help corporations. I think that's true in this case as well. The idea of being able to be a smart consumer, comparison shop, makes you a consumer. It makes you still connected in many ways to that consumer economy. It tells you, like we saw in the Progressive Era, don't worry, this is being regulated. It creates a sanction. It creates a promise that actually facilitates consumerism or urges you to now think of yourself as a savvy consumer, but you're still a consumer. So a lot of these regulations had the effect of only buoying and supporting the consumer economy, like we saw in the Progressive Era, where you were told these meat products are subject to regulation. There's no plaster in the white bread. Well, it made people want to buy processed meat and white bread. And now, in these instances where there are all of these reforms, where you're being told, don't worry, the toy you're giving to little Timmy is safe. Don't worry, you're not going to be subject to this manipulation. Don't worry, you can now be a savvy consumer and make good choices. Though regulatory and reformist, they, like previous periods of regulation, really work to support the consumer economy by, again, creating a field that seemed to be more regulated and legible and reliable. Truth in Lending Act in 1968 also targeted something that consumer advocates and other critiques of the consumer culture raised as a concern. Manipulative lending, the way in which a lot of Americans were captive to debt in the 50s and 60s to sustain that middle-class ideal and lifestyle. Truth in Lending Act required that lenders inform borrowers of interest rates, terms of payback, and also limit their ability to garnish wages if you fell behind on your payments. So again, this was designed to empower consumers. This doesn't end some of the lending practices that remained burdensome to consumers. In fact, it might encourage them to be more likely to take out loans and employ credit cards because they felt as if they're getting the truth here. So also consistent with the observation I made a moment ago about how, though some may decry this as big government meddling in the economy, it actually in many ways helps to support a consumer economy while also responding to what we've seen throughout these lectures, the critiques of a manipulative consumer economy and culture. Not only were certain products subject to regulation and calls for reform, media forms were also subject to now a more interventionist role by the federal government in the 1960s. Throughout these lectures, we talked about how advertising, television was exposed by Vance Packard and others as fraught with manipulation. In response to that was an effort to create a media that was more legible, open, transparent, and responsive to viewers. The Federal Trade Commission challenged a lot of the marketing that prevailed in the 1960s, particularly if it was seen to be deliberately deceitful or manipulative. In response to that, producers, fearing even more intervention by the FTC, said, we're going to adopt a voluntary code not to produce ads that are manipulative. So here they wanted to get away from a more direct regulation by the federal government through the FTC and adopt an ethics code so that certain messages produced by manufacturers and advertisers would be in line with this body of rules and ethics, thereby assuring consumers of those marketing messages. There was an effort to create someplace on the public airways, someplace on television free of ads and manipulation, and so this really saw the birth of public television. The Corporation for Public Broadcasting was created in 1967 to be an alternative form of entertainment on TV that, again, wasn't about selling dish soap. I hope all of you listening to this realize that TV is not produced to entertain you. TV is not produced to tell you a story. TV is produced to get you to watch advertising. In truth, the TV show is what is there to keep you hooked so that you watch the ads. What's really important to the producers of TV shows isn't the content of the show, it's the ads that play in between that content. And in 1967, there was an effort to create somewhere on the public airways, somewhere on the TV dial, a form of broadcasting that isn't about selling products, that isn't about getting you to watch ads. And so you had the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. You had the beginning of public television. From this would come shows like Sesame Street and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood in the 70s that were dedicated to education for children, not, again, selling them figurines, watches, and a variety of consumer goods. Unfortunately, this is, again, a brief moment because today there's plenty of ads on PBS and Sesame Street and other programs on PBS geared towards children are also in the marketing and toy business as well to sustain them. In fact, Sesame Street now is running first run on HBO, a pay cable service. So as we'll talk about in lectures to come, this is again a moment, a brief moment, and tides will shift again as they have in previous moments in American history. But in this moment, the 1960s, there's this, again, effort to regulate media, and from it came programming, particularly that geared towards children, that was to be ad-free. The effort here led to advocacy groups like ACT, the Action for Children's Television, which lobbied for ending ads that were geared specifically to children, meaning ads that really aren't towards adults, that are really created to reach directly to children. Now, children tend not to have much money. They tend not to have jobs. And so why are we producing ads geared towards people who can't spend money? Isn't the whole idea of ads to reach consumers, inform consumers who can make choices? That was the argument of Action for Children's Television. Why are they making ads for people who can't buy things? Well, of course, they're making ads because they realize that if they can get to children, those children will put pressure on their parents, the people with jobs and money, to buy these products. That there is this phenomenon, which we'll talk about in our next lecture on fast food, recognized by fast food industries and other industries marketing to children, known as pester power, where if they can get the kids and convince the kids to buy this product or really to desire this product, they'll pester their parents, and their parents will eventually cleave and purchase the product. But of course, all of this is set in motion through direct marketing to children. The only reason those parents are subject to pester power is because their children have been subject to these ads. The Association of National Advertisers, a lobbying group that represented marketing and advertising companies, respond to the call by Action for Children's Television to basically ban such ads by, again, a voluntary agreement, set of codes and ethics that they promise not to produce ads that will be deliberately manipulative and exploitative. So, as we've talked about earlier here with the ethics code produced by and adopted by marketers and advertisers, there's this reaction to growing advocacy, grassroots movements like Action for Children's Television, to stave off government regulation through this agreement. Well, we're not going to do this anymore. Trust us now, right? We're going to bind together. This will now have our seal of approval, and will no longer deliberately gear ads towards children. Very common in the 1960s, before a lot of these regulations, for TV shows where, like we talked about earlier with radio program in the 1920s, the host of the program would move seamlessly from what seems to be the content of the program, a little story geared towards the kids. He would just pivot to another camera and start a commercial. So there's no break. There's no indication that this is a commercial. This seems to be just part of the show. The same guy who's the host of the show is now reading an ad without a break. He just turns to the camera and says, "Hey kids, wouldn't you like to have blah, 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 blah?" Well, that was something that was targeted in these guidelines. We're no longer going to have hosts of shows also be the advertisers of the show, that there will be at least some break that indicates that the show is over and now it's a commercial. And you can see this to this day when McDonald's urges kids who buy Happy Meal to go on their website or download the app. There's this statement by the Happy Meal character, "Hey kids, this is marketing," right? You know, where McDonald's is covering its ass saying, "Oh, we're being clear that this is a marketing message from the McDonald Corporation," right? I'm sure kids are very mindful of that, right? So again, this is in some ways got around through such efforts where there's an acknowledgement, again, of a commercial, a marketing in that way, but of course it's really geared to keep the kids captive in that fashion. When this regulation goes into force and you can no longer have a host move seamlessly to an ad, that ad still runs, and the child's program still is replete with ads. So marketing endures, albeit now with some different forms of regulation designed to quell a lot of the anger and resistance that's developing here in the critiques, the consumer advocacy that we've documented in these lectures. The National Association of Broadcasters, a advocacy group of local TV stations, were vital to this call for ending host advertising, where the host was also reading the ads. So these reforms and regulations take place. And again, it's interesting to think about, well, much like we've talked about in the previous slide and in previous episodes in American history of consumerism, this again is designed to make people more likely to watch TV rather than less likely, because they're given these assurances. Another development in this period that represents a backlash to consumerism, a suspicion of the mindless consumerism of the post-war period, the modern environmentalist movement. A new word entered the, at least California and later American vocabulary during World War II, smog, a hybrid of two words, smoke and fog, where it was apparent in Los Angeles even during World War II, when there was, of course, a great deal of rationing of gasoline, that you can see the sky. You're not supposed to see the sky, right? It's supposed to be clear, right? But there was this, overhang, this cloud. Of course, we're all familiar with it here as Southern Californians. And for the first time, it was identified, and a word was coined to express it, smog. And it made people aware of the effects of cars and burning of fossil fuels was having on what was seen as this pristine world of Southern California. In the 1960s, there were growing exposés of a variety of effects of consumerism, including contamination, pollution, Also in the 1960s, there were major power outages in American cities where the power grid could not meet the demands of an increasingly electrified America, plugging in its TVs and electric razors and vacuums. And that's important because it seemed to indicate limits. A limit on what was often celebrated as the boundless affluence of the post-war period. That maybe we can't just run our mixers and blenders constantly. That maybe the world, the natural world, or infrastructure and power grid can accommodate more, and that was really vital to the environmentalist movement, the consumer critiques of people like Vance Packard, that this is unsustainable, that you cannot just constantly make more and more waste or more and more stuff, because we can't necessarily supply the power necessary to such a lifestyle. But the publication that's most credited with sparking the modern environmentalist movement is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which focused on a pesticide, DDT, and its harmful impact on animals and humans. DDT was being sprayed on many crops in America as part of that effort of affluence associated with abundance of food, which we've talked so much about here in the post-war period, to try to maximize yields, to sell, maximize yields around the globe. In America, which had a farm economy that was really so much defined by international trade. So to kill pests and maximize yield, DDT was used widely, and Carson exposed its deleterious effects. She called for other forms of pest control that wouldn't have that effect, the ruinous chemicals like DDT. What this did, this focus on DDT, was to really create again a moment to think about the effects of more. If mass food production was about affluence, it was about a good life. We've seen that again in many instances, how lots of food, a refrigerator full of food, was a marker of the good life right alongside suburban homes and automobiles, kitchens of the kitchen debate. What is the cost of that? Carson made us think differently about that there was a true degradation that came. And we need to be aware of that there are limits, witness the power outages in this period, consequences, witness pollution and degradation of the natural environment. And because of that, we need to, in some case, embrace limits and restraint in order to preserve something larger and more important, health and a clean environment. From Carson's book came the modern environmentalist movement, which led to calls for regulation. In the 60s and 70s, there were major rivers in America that were heavily polluted, that were routinely closed off because of pollution levels. Some rivers caught on fire. How does a river catch on fire? Well, it was so laden with trash and pollutants that overwhelmed the water in the river, and the rivers caught on fire. I talked about the way in which many products, consumer products, were made with hazardous ingredients and parts like lead paint. There was a call for regulating what actually could be included. Corporations should not be allowed to produce whatever they wanted, that there's a higher and larger interest at stake here. Concern about increasing extinction of animal species, and this led to, again, regulation, like the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, that was signed into law by a conservative Republican named Richard Nixon. Believe it or not, some of the landmark environmental regulation that comes out of the environmentalist movement, and we still rely upon in actions designed to stop pernicious, deleterious impacts on our environment. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, those are all signed into law by a conservative Republican, Richard Nixon, who responded to this groundswell that wasn't political, that wasn't partisan. In this period, being an environmentalist wasn't limited to one party. It was part of a broader movement, which we've been documenting in these lectures. And so, with that strong public support, you had even the conservative Republican, Richard Nixon, signing into law the Clean Air Act and Endangered Species Act. In April of 1970, the first Earth Day was held, and it was a huge event. Sadly, tragically, Earth Day isn't as well celebrated and commemorated today as it was in its first iteration in 1970, really at the zenith of this blossoming movement. 20 million Americans participated in rallies around the country. Major rock bands held concerts as part of an overall celebration of Mother Earth and a growing awareness of environmentalism. Environmentalism intersected with other elements of the counterculture, feminism, civil rights. So much of the environmental degradation affected adversely racial minorities. Environmentalism is a civil rights, racial justice issue. Intersected with many elements of the broader social movements of this period, as well as an outgrowth of what we've stressed in these lectures, how in the 60s Americans were thinking differently about consumerism and the way in which it offered a false vision of the good life, one that was undergirded by waste, advanced through lies and manipulation, one that aggrandized wealth and power in the hands of the few and foreclosed opportunity and power for the many. That again is a broad way of describing the counterculture, and that broad sensibility of this key moment in American social and cultural history again is also visible through consumerism. In this case, the anti-consumerist elements that would see greater regulation and also the fruition of this environmentalist movement. Oh, but History 119, it's an argument, it's a debate. We began these two lectures on critiques and countercultures by presenting this moment in American life as a jousting, an argument, a critique of the prevalence and predominance of the celebration of consumerism that we've documented in previous lectures on the Cold War, on the post-war ideal, even in civil rights, which, as critical as it was of American institutions, still embraced consumerism as something that should be available and open to racial minorities. But with this moment of prominence for the more domination thesis and critique of consumerism would come a backlash and counter to it, as this is an ongoing debate, an argument regarding our consumer culture. And in the 1970s, the decade that followed this regulatory reformist moment of the 1960s, this countercultural moment of the 1960s, the country would cleave in a very conservative direction. And we are, in our last two lectures in the class, going to look at the 70s, 80s, and 90s as a very conservative era in American life, which in many ways returns to a Gilded Age or 1920s period that we examined earlier. It's the ebb and flow, it's the jousting, the argument from moments like the progressive era, the New Deal, and the 1960s counterculture, to moments like the Gilded Age, the 1920s, the 1950s, and the late 20th century, where there's a more pro-business, pro-corporation, conservative ethic in America, and with it, a broad celebration of materialism and consumerism. The 60s was a remarkable moment, but it was just a moment in the ongoing argument without end regarding consumerism. The decade that would follow, though, would be one of conservative ascendance and, in many ways, a rejection of the more communitarian sensibilities of the 60s. It's often said that the 60s was a we decade, where people banded together in efforts to change society. There was civil rights, there was feminism, there was gay rights, there was the anti-Vietnam movement, the student protest movement. And we've seen in these lectures here how that, again, was related to consumerism. Tom Wolfe, the American novelist, called the 70s the me decade. by which he meant this was a decade where many people rejected the communitarian, social efforts of the 60s and instead prized individuality, prized individualism, and a rejection of social movements designed to address larger social issues. Some of this, like we talked about in the 1920s, was a sense of disillusionment that these efforts of the 60s had failed. The Me Decade was Tom Wolfe's description of the decade that followed the 60s, which in many ways was very critical of collective action of the 60s, of the, again, mass movements, finding that they had failed or a rejection of their ethos and spirit from the beginning. The 70s would be a period where America would cleave back towards individualism, and this often manifests in our consumer culture with the emphasis on physical fitness. 1970s was the really first decade in American life where there's this great emphasis on bodybuilding, fitness. You would see the opening of major chains of gyms. It was in the 1970s that Americans for the first time learned the name of an Austrian immigrant who will later go on to be governor of California and sign my diploma, Arnold Schwarzenegger, in the documentary Pumping Iron. There was a jogging craze in the 1970s where people were out jogging. Now, I have a dog, and therefore I have to wake up early every morning and walk the dog, or he shits on the carpet. That's my choice, right? Wake up early, walk the dog, or shit on the carpet. Well, I don't like shit on the carpet, so I walk my dog. But when I'm up early in the morning walking my dog, I see these other people up also before the sun comes up very early. They don't have dogs. Shit on the carpet is not a problem for them. And yet they're up running. They're just running. They're jogging. No one's chasing them. They're just running for the hell of it. I don't understand this behavior. It's bizarre behavior, right? I know why I'm awake. Why the hell are they awake, and why the hell are they running? Well, that America today where everyone has a gym membership, everyone's obsessed with six-pack abs, everyone's waking up and jogging, began in the 70s. And it's very illustrative of this me sensibility, self-improvement of the body, the mind, a very individualistic ethos. That's what Wolfe meant by the Me Decade, where there's emphasis on self-development, even of the body, even of one's physical self, that would lead to fascination with bodybuilding and hobbies like jogging. Also in the 1970s, there was an emphasis on self-actualization. TM, Transcendental Meditation, was very popular in the 70s, where harried housewives and overwhelmed husbands were encouraged to go into the family room in their suburban wonderland and sit and meditate and contemplate their true selves. So the Me Decade, the very astute observation of Wolfe, we historians often rely on novelists to explain history for us. Remember, it was a novelist, Mark Twain, who coined the phrase Gilded Age. It was a novelist, Tom Wolfe, that coined this term Me Decade. Was an emphasis on individualism that did often manifest in consumerism, but it also played a key role in the conservative turn in American politics that will move away from the more regulatory reform effort that we've seen here in the 1960s. In 1980, at the end of the 1970s, Ronald Reagan. Yeah, remember him, right? The guy who hosted the opening of Disneyland will be elected president. We're going to talk a lot about Ronald Reagan as we look at the 80s. In that period, Ronald Reagan would preside over an effort to deregulate the economy, lower taxes for the rich. Yeah, sounds a lot like the 1920s. Remember that? Industrial freedom, free the businessman. And also, not coincidentally, as we'll soon see in lectures to come, 1980s, like the 1920s, saw this celebration of the rich, veneration of the rich, focus on the rich, love the rich. A very Bruce Barton moment redo. And that's because the conservative movement that was ascendant, that will elect Reagan, that will preside over this much more deregulatory effort in the consumer economy and culture and celebration of the rich, was one that embraced individualism. It too was an outgrowth of the Me Decade. They called for freeing businessmen from an oppressive and interventionist government, lowering taxes. Conservatives often celebrated individualism as an ideal in American life. That too is part of the Me Decade. And it will usher in, again, our focus in some of our last lectures as we look at the late 20th century and the consumer economy and culture that developed then that will rhyme a lot with what you've seen earlier in periods like the Gilded Age, the 1920s, as again we see this jousting, this interplay between the domination and triumphalist arguments, this jousting, this debate America has about the virtues or, as we've seen in these last two lectures, vices and demerits of a consumer culture.